Our first lecture for Unit 2 is an introduction to metabolism. The living cell, as you may recall from the very first introductory talk I gave, is a miniature factory where thousands of reactions are occurring every second. In essence, one of the main goals of the cell, or main jobs, is to convert energy in many different ways. And an organism's metabolism ultimately transforms matter and energy subject to the standard laws of thermodynamics. As you can see from this very complicated map on the right, the cell is performing literally thousands of reactions every second. And this was an attempt to sort of map the metabolism of a cell. So as a definition, though, metabolism is the totality of an organism's chemical reaction, and it ultimately arises from the interactions between molecules. What I really want you to understand from this map is certainly not the details, but to appreciate the complexity of what goes on inside a cell, and what metabolism really encompasses is all of these different chemical reactions. And indeed, molecules from one reaction ultimately feed into another reaction, as you can see from all of the different arrows and lines across the table. A metabolic pathway has many different steps then. So not only do these different pathways interact with one another, but they're also complex in that they tend to not be very one-step type reactions. Ultimately, the pathway begins with a specific molecule, and here the starting molecule would be this one in green is A. And at each point, a different enzyme then acts on the molecule. They're catalyzed by specific enzymes to ultimately wind up with a resultant product listed here as D. And what you can also appreciate is that at different points in each of the reactions, different enzymes will act on the different products as we, or metabolites, I should say, as we move through the pathway. There's two different main types of pathways that we'll deal with. One are catabolic pathways, and this is when you break down these more complex molecules into simpler compounds. As part of catabolism, there is a release of energy. On the other hand, the second type of pathway we'll deal with is this one on the bottom, and these are anabolic pathways. Anabolic, in essence, or anabolism, is the building up of more complicated molecules from simpler ones. And in essence, when you have anabolism, you ultimately consume energy. So what is energy? As though I talk about it, is the capacity to cause change or to do work. It exists in various forms, of which some can perform work. There's two main types of energy. There's kinetic energy, and this is the energy associated with motion. And then there's potential energy, and this is energy that's stored in the location of matters. This includes chemical energy stored in molecular structure, and by this we mean the energy that's stored in the bonds between the different atoms that make up a molecule. And so potential energy is energy stored in bonds. In the body, though, the key molecule that we will talk about when we deal with energy is ATP. And energy is released from ATP when this terminal phosphate bond right here is broken. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the triphosphate comes from these three phosphate molecules attached to the sugar moiety here. And so when you break off this last phosphate of ATP, converting ATP to ADP, ultimately you then release energy. And so ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate, di meaning now only two phosphates attached to the sugar, where you've released this one inorganic phosphate and ultimately released energy as well. And so this is the main storage energy molecule in the cell, and we will ultimately talk about how the cell makes ATP to have energy to perform many other different functions. ATP itself is, as we said, the energy molecule. So how do we harness the energy found in that phosphate bond to do other things? Well, in essence, we in the cell, you couple ATP hydrolysis, or the break off of that third phosphate, to other reactions so that the other reactions can occur. And an example here would be if you want to combine glutamic acid and ammonia to make glutamine. This is a very unfavorable reaction. You see here the delta G, it requires an input of 3.4 kilocalories per mole. And so the cell could not do this reaction on its own. It needs too much input of energy. But if you couple this reaction with the breakdown of ATP, each time you remove that third phosphate, ATP breakdown to ADP, that's actually the delta G here, and this should say minus 7.3 kilocalories per mole. And then ultimately, the overall delta G is then negative, and together the reaction can then occur and is indeed spontaneous. There are 3 different types of cellular work. All are powered by the hydrolysis of ATP. The 3 different types of cellular work are mechanical work, transport work, and then chemical work. Mechanical work, in the example here, would be something that we find in our muscle cells with the 2 proteins actin and myosin. And in essence, what happens is ATP phosphorylates these motor proteins, which allows them to slide past each other and then allows your muscles to ultimately contract. Transport work involves changing or interacting with membrane proteins to allow some sort of solute to be transported across the membrane. And also then there's chemical work, and this is what we see when we're dealing with those metabolic reactions, coupling ATP hydrolysis with some sort of metabolic reaction so that the reaction can then favorably occur. The regeneration of ATP then is also important, and we'll get into the details as to how this happens. But as you can imagine, if you continue to break down the ATP to ADP plus phosphate, there must also be some sort of mechanism such that you can regenerate the ATP. And so ATP going to ADP ultimately results in this energy for cellular work. And then you need to ultimately regenerate these ATP molecules, doing so from energy from catabolism. And this is the breakdown, if you will, of some other molecules and ultimately form ATP. And so this is just a quick foray into what is metabolism and what is the sort of key molecule in the cell for energy production. Then now we will move into the next lecture, which deals very briefly with the concept of enzymes.